Hello once again, everyone, and thanks for joining us for Sunday's edition of Alaska Weather, almost a week into November 2022. I'm meteorologist David Percy. Up first, let's see, we've got strong winds moved into the eastern Bering Sea, all the way from the eastern Aleutians, right on up to the northwest coast, even the western Arctic coast. Cape Lisburne, a peak wind gust 84 miles per hour. And then down eastern Aleutians, Unimak Island. On the west end of Unimak Island, Nikolsky had a 77 mile per hour wind gust. And then back to the north on the northwest coast there, south of Kivalina, Red Dog Dock, 68 miles an hour. And then the Bering Strait, Tin City, 67 miles per hour. And with those winds, we've got a lot of red shaded areas here on the hazardous weather graphic. Western Arctic coast, northwest coast, Noatak Valley, Kotzebue, most of the Seward Peninsula, Norton Sound area, as well as Galena down into the Grayling area, on out to the Yukon Delta. All of those winter storm warnings out for tonight into Monday night and Tuesday in some cases for blizzard conditions with snow, blowing snow. Visibility is reduced to a quarter mile at times in the blowing snow, and winds gusting anywhere from 40 to 70 miles per hour. There's a coastal flood advisory out for the St. Lawrence Island area and the Bering Strait coast, and that's for Monday and Tuesday. And also for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, a high surf advisory also, or actually a coastal flood advisory, out for the same time period for late tonight and through Monday night into Tuesday. And then in the Alaska Range there, mostly the eastern Alaska Range, that's a high wind warning out for winds actually for Monday and Tuesday. Tomorrow and Tuesday for south winds 35 to 45 miles an hour with possible gusts of 75 miles per hour. And moving on, winter weather advisory for the areas north and west of King Salmon and Bristol Bay there. You can see the map there showing the heaviest snowfall up north and west of King Salmon, actually from about Dillingham over to Togiak, Platinum, and northward there, just west of Koliginek. Koliginek looking at 2 to 3 inches of snow, and that's 9 p.m. this evening until 9 a.m. Monday morning. Snow and blowing snow, total snow accumulations of up to 8 inches, with winds gusting as high as 45 miles an hour. And you can see again those snowfall amounts. Koliginek looking at about 3 inches. Same thing for AKwx and Dillingham, maybe 4 to 6 inches there, and in that 6 to 8 inch range, Platinum and Togiak with a little higher amounts to the north of Togiak Bay there. And for the satellite imagery, you can see one system pushing northward and then taking a turn to the east into over the top of the ridge of high pressure there, spreading clouds across much of the northern interior. Eastern areas there, that's mostly mid and high level clouds, with warmer temperatures pulling, had rain today, St. Lawrence Island, and bringing those strong winds into the areas for the Cape Lisburne, Point Hope area, Tin City, and then a stronger system moving northward there, coming across the eastern Aleutians, bringing the strong winds and some rain into those areas, about maybe a little less than half an inch today falling over the eastern Aleutians, about 3 to 4/10 of an inch falling in the Pribilof Islands. So nothing exceptionally heavy precipitation-wise, more of a wind producer than rain producer there. But clear skies, cold temperatures, south central Alaska, winds coming down throughout the North Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound. Still pretty gusty today, but lighter winds this afternoon than there was this morning in the Copper River Basin, and also strong winds over the Panhandle, up to 70 to 80 mile an hour gusts in Lynn Canal with clear skies, cold temperatures there. Should last tonight and through tomorrow as well, with the storminess staying mostly to the west, strong high pressure over the eastern interior, keeping that mostly to the west, kind of directing it to the northeast and then to the east. And But the next system coming up will eventually make a jog eastward there as the high retreats into the northwest territories of Canada and allow some warmer temperatures and increasing moisture into even the central interior, south central Alaska areas. On the chart today, you can see that very strong 1,053 millibar high now centered over the Yukon. And then the gradient there along the west coast producing those strong winds with the snow and blowing snow. Actually reaching the central Arctic coast now, but back down across the northwest coast into the Seward Peninsula. Mixture of precipitation, St. Lawrence Island. And winds starting to lighten up there now. And stronger storm, that front and the tighter gradient bringing those very strong winds into the eastern Aleutians. And look at the Alaska Peninsula today with about a half an inch of rain falling. And again, lighter rainfall over the Pribilof Islands. Lighter winds and more showery out over the western Aleutians there. And then a lot of lines across the Panhandle supporting those 50 to 75 mile an hour wind gusts they had in the channeled and exposed areas there of much of the southeast coast, with the strongest winds 70 to 80 miles an hour recorded in Lynn Canal earlier today, but slackening gradient along the North Gulf Coast and those winds slowly coming down. Still pretty gusty there at Valdez and the Matanuska Valley. And that'll continue to diminish tonight. May see some mid and high level clouds coming into the Kenai Peninsula and south central Alaska. That'll same thing. Clouds will slowly increase and begin to thicken over the central interior. Should stay clear over the eastern interior, but a little more breezy conditions there will keep the temperatures probably warmer than what they were this morning, Monday morning. Still windy and cold with strong high pressure over the northwest territories there, keeping the Arctic air in over all of the southeast coast, and that low center tracks north to near or just west of the Pribilof Islands. And again, the snow and blowing snow over the southwest interior up to the Bering Strait and Seward Peninsula, up to the western Arctic coast, Noatak Valley, and the northwest coast. More westerly flow with areas of light rain, much lighter winds out over the central western Aleutians, but another trough swinging through the Fox Islands will kick the winds up with another shot of rain. That'll improve tomorrow with much lighter winds across the central and eastern Aleutians, rain changing to showers for the Alaska Peninsula. And the push of warm air will mix precipitation, rain mixed with snow over the southwest interior, but staying mostly snow and blowing snow, Seward Peninsula up to the northwest coast. Snow advancing in toward the central interior tomorrow and tomorrow afternoon into the Matanuska Valley. Chances of precipitation increase. Starting out as snow, then trending toward mixed rain and snow over the Kenai Peninsula, rain for Kodiak Island, and clouds now all the way to the eastern border over the eastern interior, but still clear, cold, and winds diminishing across the southeast coast. And for Tuesday, the Panhandle looking at cloudier conditions with a chance of some areas of light snow, temperatures on the upswing now, and low pressure over Bristol Bay keeps it kind of wet there and mild, but winds on the light side, a little gusty there for the eastern Aleutians, and breezy and wet for Kodiak Island with a front that's not all that strong, but areas of snow over the western central interior, pretty light in the central interior, some of that reaching over toward the border, but that'll be just flurries at best, snow and blowing snow for the northwest part of the state and the western Arctic coast down to possibly the Bering Strait. And lows tonight, mid-teens, northern Panhandle, mid-20s out along the central coast, and 18 below. Forecast low for Gulf Canada tonight, otherwise single numbers. South central Alaska, Kuskokwim Valley, upper teens for Bristol Bay near 30 Kodiak Island. Highs upper 30s for Bristol Bay, and 20s and 30s for the Kuskokwim Valley. Upper 20s, South central Alaska, about 10 for the Copper River Basin. 20s to lower 30s, lower 20s to lower 30s for the Panhandle. And then the lows, lower teens to lower 20s for the southeast coast, and right around zero for the Copper River Basin, 20 to 30 in the Kuskokwim Valley. Lower 30s, Bristol Bay, and 20s for the south central Alaska. Highs, mid-40s, Kodiak Island, in the 30s west of the Alaska Range, actually east of the Alaska Range too. Warming conditions, mid-30s for much of the Kenai Peninsula, south central Alaska. Up to the north, pretty cold this morning. Arctic Village and Chicken down to 31 below with Fort Yukon at minus 25. We'll see the lows tonight forecast to be much warmer. Arctic Village at minus 12 and Chicken minus 1 with 1 degree for Tanana, and then into the 20s out toward the Bering Strait coast. Highs on Monday afternoon, 0 to 15 in the east.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Moving on to flying weather, good VFR over much of interior Alaska starting out Monday morning. Some IFR up over the Yukon Flats there, Chukchitsik, Fort Yukon, maybe down to Beaver, that general area due to low clouds and some fog. Otherwise, marginal VFR for the western Arctic coast, central Arctic coast, western North Slope with some IFR catching Point Hope, Cape Lisburne. Then a big area of IFR pushing into the southwest coast, St. Lawrence Island, southward to the Pribilofs, eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula, and better out to the west. Good VFR, Kodiak Island, North Gulf Coast, and the Panhandle. And for Monday afternoon, that area of IFR over the Yukon Flats burns off. VFR over the eastern part of the state, including the Panhandle. But you can see IFR pushing into Cook Inlet and the Kenai Peninsula, down into Bristol Bay and the Alaska Range there, or the Aleutian Range, Kodiak Island, back up across the southwest coast, and fair ways inland, almost to the central interior there, going up the Yukon River Valley and up to the western Arctic coast, northern Bering Sea. Southern Bering Sea Aleutians becoming VFR, and stays VFR for the Panhandle Tuesday morning with marginal VFR with some areas of IFR progressing into the central and northeast interior. More solid IFR there from St. Seward Peninsula, Norton Sound, all of the eastern and northern Bering Sea down to the Fox Islands, eastward Kodiak Island, Bristol Bay, right up into Prince William Sound, marginal VFR elsewhere. And for the afternoon Tuesday, we've got marginal VFR pushing into the northern Panhandle now, staying VFR to the south. Areas of IFR there for the northern interior valleys just south of the Brooks Range, but the North Slope Arctic coast, mostly VFR. A little lower conditions there from Point Lay down to Kivalina. And IFR St. Lawrence Island, all the southwest coast, Bristol Bay areas. And then looks like VFR for the Pribilof Islands, central and western Aleutians, becoming VFR for Unmak Island, Nikolsky. Anatuvik, another VFR day coming up for the Brooks Range. Anatuvik and Adigan looking pretty good tomorrow with VFR flying. Lake Clark and Merrill becoming IFR into the afternoon, or especially in the afternoon, probably actually during the morning hours and continuing through the afternoon. Same thing for Rainy, IFR, Windy, marginal VFR, Isabel, VFR, Mintasta, VFR, Tanita, VFR, becoming marginal VFR, and for Portage, VFR, becoming marginal. Chilkoot and White, VFR for another day. And the freezing levels, 10,000 feet up over the Alaska Peninsula and 2,000 feet up to the lower Yukon River Valley, actually into the southern delta, and at the surface hugging the North Gulf Coast as well as the southwest coast and the Panhandle. And taking a look at icing, areas of isolated moderate rime icing there from moving in to Cook Inlet and the Kenai Peninsula area, extending northwestward there to the western Arctic coast, Seward Peninsula, and then out over the central Bering Sea to the central and eastern Aleutians. And the jet stream, southwest flow, 65 to up to 100 knots there over northeast Bristol Bay into the Kuskokwim Valley and western Alaska Peninsula, or Alaska Range. And then those strong northerlies up to 120 knots right down across the Panhandle as that ridge shifts eastward. So at 9,000 feet, those northerly winds become northeast up to 50 to 60 knots there for the Panhandle. And out to the west, low pressure tracking up to west of St. Lawrence Island, west-southwest, 60 knots right into the interior there, south 65 knots across the Brooks Range, and up to 70 knots for the Kuskokwim Valley from the south and southeast. Extends all the way up along the northwest coast, 50 knots from the west-southwest, just south of St. Lawrence Island, and northeast at about 40 now for the southern Panhandle, lighter winds to the north, and westerlies at 50 knots for the western Aleutians. And looking at turbulence, we'll see quite an area of considerable moderate turbulence, surface to 6,000 feet from the Brooks Range across much of western interior Alaska, a little bit better for the Yukon Delta, but all the way down to Bristol Bay, Kodiak Island, Cook Inlet, and for the central and southern southeast coast, about surface to 5,000 feet. And also for the western Aleutians with the next system there, looking at consider moderate chop from Shimanat 2 to Adak, but not too bad for the Bering Sea, Eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula. St. Lawrence Island, considerable moderate chop expected there as well. After the break, I'll be back with the marine forecasts.
Welcome back to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder, and joining us once again is Eric Stevens, our good friend from GINA, the Geographic Information Network of Alaska, based up at UAF. And thanks for joining us, Eric. Really appreciate it.
Oh, happy to be here, Dave.
And we love to hear about all the fascinating developments, new and old, and how we're using the tools here, especially around Alaska. And I've got to think that, satellite meteorology right now is a fascinating time to be involved in. If we go back to the first satellite, Tyros, back in 1960, I think is when we got some of those first pictures. Weather and meteorology probably changed that day for a whole lot of people, and it's still changing today, right?
Oh, you know it. Satellite imagery is so important, and it's getting better all the time. Yeah. Of course, never perfect, but especially for us in Alaska, where there are other data sets like radars and weather balloons are so thinly spread. Right. The satellite is the great equalizer because the satellite sees everything.
Right.
Yeah. Right. We've got one particular issue in volcanic ash detection.
That's a big deal here. Yeah.
You know it. If you fly an airplane into volcanic ash, your jet engine might just fail. And an airplane without engines is in a world of hurt. Sure. So if there's a volcano that goes off, satellite imagery is the way to track that plume of ash and to tell pilots this is where you need to not be to avoid this ash plume. And there's a phrase out there, what's the difference? What's the difference?
Okay.
Well, it turns out, what we're going to discuss today, that the difference is everything. There's a technique called channel differencing. Okay. That if you take one piece of the spectrum of what the satellite detects and a slightly different wavelength of that spectrum, even though those two images might look similar, magical things happen when you subtract one from the other. And they reveal information that was already there, but it was hard to find until you did that subtraction.
This sounds like Nicolas Cage in National Treasure when he's got those fancy glasses and he's flipping one up and back and forth. I mean, is this what we're talking about?
Well, let's go more highbrow and talk Michelangelo. Oh, so apparently Michelangelo made some amazing sculpture, and someone said, Michael, that's amazing. How did you do it? And Michelangelo's reply allegedly was, well, in that rock, the statue was already in there. Right. I just scraped away the unnecessary bits. In satellite meteorology, sometimes there are meteorological features that are in the data, but you can't see it until you combine or difference some of the channels. Okay. And we've got a case, good old Pavlov volcano goes off now and then. Sure. And you can observe directly a picture of the volcano. Just take it with your iPhone. You can see a volcano going off. Yep. Right. But if you want to get the broad view, we need satellite to do that. Now, there are a couple of wavelengths that we can look at. So what's a wavelength? That's the amount of space between a peak and a valley and another peak in a certain part of the electromagnetic spectrum. We're going to look at 12 micron wavelength and 10.8 micron wavelength.
What is a micron?
So what's a micron? Yeah, we're getting into the geek department now. A micron is a unit of length, and it is quite tiny. We're looking at what's called long wave wavelengths, but it takes 25,000 of these microns to make an inch. A human blood cell is about 5 microns across. So when we're talking about 12 micron imagery as allegedly long wave, well, that's relative.
Pretty short for light.
Yeah, it's other part of the, it's just an expression for the spectrum there. Okay. So we can look at a 12 micron image, say a satellite image. At 12 microns, we're seeing a heat signature here, really, and the way this color enhancement works is the yellow and the red stuff is high cold clouds down here over the Gulf of Alaska into South Central. And if you were asked, where do you find the volcanic ash plume in this image?
Hey, where do you find the volcanic plume in this image?
It's hard to do. I'm not sure I could find it. If you were to look at this image and just say, show me what jumps out at you here, I'd say, well, nothing really. Well, let's look. So 12 micron doesn't help us. Let's look at 10.8 microns. All right. All right, look at that. It's practically the same image. So where's this volcanic ash? Can't find it at 12 microns, can't really see it at 10.8, but when we subtract one channel from the other, magically the plume appears. The color enhancement here highlights the ash in blue.
Wow.
The information was already there, but we couldn't find it until we subtracted one channel from another.
Very interesting.
It's almost magical. Similarly, let's say you're looking for fog up on the north slope. It's kind of a foggy neighborhood.
Sure.
In 11 micron and 3.9 micron, we've got a 3.9 micron image here. It's a big fuzzy blur over Barrow. We can't see where the fog is. But the information is lurking in there waiting for us to reveal it. All we have to do is find that difference between the 11 micron and the 3.9, and then this image becomes this image, and the fog bank jumps right out, and you can see it up there at Barrow. Now, you got to choose the right tool for the job.
Sure.
Like they say, you open your toolbox, all kinds of stuff in there. What do we need for this particular task? If you want to find volcanic ash, we look at 12 and 10.8 micron, find that difference. If you want to find fog, we'll look at 11 and 3.9 micron, find that difference. It's great, different tools for different jobs. Of course, there's always caveats and gotchas, but this fog procedure, it only works at night, because when the sun comes up, it gets in the way. So every product has its strengths and limitations, and in meteorology, the challenge is using the right tool for the right job, and these are some of those tools.
And discovery is still happening, even with meteorology. The weather's been around for a long time, but the tools that are being developed to understand the meteorology is fascinating and still very new science.
It's such a young science. We've come so far. And I'm getting old enough now that I can literally say that, you know, when I was a boy, we didn't have this kind of thing. And there's new things happening all the time. New satellites will be launched in coming years that will have better instruments than ever before. It's an exciting time, and this is so helpful for Alaska because satellites help fill in the gaps between other ways of observing the weather. Satellites, the great equalizer for Alaska.
Yeah, and help so many people stay safe in so many ways every day up here in the last frontier.
Yeah, that's what it's all about, protecting lives and property.
Well, thank you so much for joining us again, Eric. We love to hear about this fascinating information, and boy, it just makes me want to go watch satellite pictures all day. So hopefully we're inspiring more people to do the same thing, and just be curious. It's a wonderful thing. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts, and we'll see you next time.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Moving on to coastal water forecasts. Gale warnings out for the central and south coast of the Panhandle. Winds northeast 35 knots, seas 17 to 19 feet. And for the north coast, northeast winds 25 knots. Gale warnings for Lynn Canal. North winds at 40 knots for the day Monday. And Stevens Passage still carrying gale force winds there. Out of the north at 35 knots. Small craft advisories for Clarence Strait. Winds north 25 knots. And for the day on Tuesday. For the south coast, lighter winds east to south at about 20 knots, and small craft advisories for the north coast, south to southeast winds 25 knots. Lynn Canal still breezy, but coming down, downward trend in the winds. All areas 30 knots from the north, 6-foot seas. Small craft advisories for Clarence Strait, for Stevens Passage. North winds at 25 knots. Clarence Strait, north winds at 20. Prince William Sound. East winds 15 knots, seas 3 feet, and for the North Gulf Coast, southeast winds 15 to 25 knots, with seas 4 to 5 feet. Gale warnings for the Barren Islands and Kamishak Bay, southeast winds 35 to 40 knots. Southern Cook Inlet, northeast winds at 30 knots, and north of the Forelands, winds will be northeast at 15. And then on Tuesday, Cook Inlet, small craft advisories, north winds 25 knots. Seas up to 7 feet. Gale warnings for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands for east-southeast winds at 35 knots. And Prince William Sound, east winds 30 knots, seas 6 feet. Gale warnings for the eastern North Gulf Coast, southeast winds at 40 knots with seas at 16 feet. And for the western North Gulf Coast, east winds at 30. Kodiak Island, gale warnings, southeast winds 40 knots, 16-foot seas. For the Alaska Peninsula, gale warnings also, south winds 40 to 45 knots. Storm warnings for Bristol Bay for southeast winds 50 to 60 knots. And on Tuesday, for the Alaska Peninsula, gale warnings, west winds 40 knots. Bristol Bay, lighter winds in store for Tuesday from the southeast at 20 knots. And Kodiak Island, small craft advisories for south winds at 25 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians on Monday, west winds 20 to 25 knots. And for the central Aleutians, west-southwest winds 20 to 25 knots. Western Aleutians west winds 25 to 30 knots. And for the day Tuesday, Western Aleutians, we've got southwest winds at 30 to 35 knots. Central Aleutians, west winds 30 to 35 knots, seas 14 feet. And gale warnings for the eastern Aleutians, west to southwest winds 35 to 40 knots with seas running 12 to 14 feet. And for the southwest coast, gale warnings for Monday, south winds 40 to 45 knots. Gale warnings for St. Matthew Island, south winds 35 knots, southwest at 30 for the Pribilofs, Norton Sound, and St. Lawrence Island. Gale warnings for southeast winds at 40 knots. And for the day on Tuesday, south winds 30 knots, Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island. West-southwest winds 25 to 30 knots for the southwest coast. St. Matthew, St. George, and St. Paul Island, southwest winds at 30 knots. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast Monday, east winds at 25 knots. Small craft advisories for the central and west coast. For east-southeast winds 25 to 30 knots in the Chukchi Sea, east winds at 40. And for Tuesday, southwest winds 40 knots for the Chukchi Sea. Western Arctic coast, south winds 40 to 45 knots. And the central coast, south at 30 knots. And then south to southwest winds 20 to 25 for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast. And for tonight, snow and blowing snow with winter storm warnings are out for the Yukon Delta, St. Lawrence, or for the Seward Peninsula, the northwest coast, and the western Arctic coast for blizzard conditions. Clouds will gradually increase over the central interior. It'll be another clear, cold night over the eastern interior, maybe not quite as cold. It'll stay windy, clear, and cold over the Panhandle with strong high pressure over the Yukon. Look for moisture to move into Kodiak Island. Strong winds and rain heavy at times for the Alaska Peninsula as that low tracks northward. That'll push eastward and northward with mixture of precipitation over the southwest interior. Rain heavy at times for Kodiak, and look for increasing chances of snow over south central Alaska. Stays dry over the Panhandle. And for Tuesday, look for cloudy conditions. Clouds will increase and temperatures start to moderate for the southeast coast with maybe a chance of snow. Snow likely over the western interior, snow and blowing snow in the northwest coast and interior.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.